Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we drift back to a moment when one city held the attention of the entire world. The year was 1975. The war in Vietnam had stretched across decades. Yet in the space of a single dramatic day, history gathered its weight and changed direction. In the streets of Saigon, uncertainty filled the air. Armies were closing in. Radios carried urgent messages. Helicopters circled above a restless city as diplomats, soldiers, journalists, and families waited to see what the next hour would bring. The Fall of Saigon was not only the end of a battle. It was the closing chapter of a long conflict that had shaped nations and divided generations. It was a moment of strategy in politics, but also one of human stories. Courage appeared in unexpected places. Decisions were made in minutes that would echo for lifetimes. In this journey, we will explore the events that led to that unforgettable day, the dramatic evacuation that followed, and the powerful images that still shape how the world remembers the end of the Vietnam War. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, settle in and allow the day to fade away. Let your shoulders soften and allow your breathing to slow. Allow your mind to wander back through time as we explore this remarkable chapter of history. Let's begin. Saigon fell in a single morning that ended a generation of war. By dawn on the 30th of April, the long conflict in Vietnam had reached the kind of ending that feels impossible until it arrives. For years, the war had expanded across jungles, villages, capitals, and television screens around the world. Then, in only a few hours, the state that had depended on vast American support ceased to exist. That speed is part of what still makes the moment so astonishing. Enormous wars usually seem to end with treaties, conferences, and long transitions. Here, a capital simply tipped. Orders changed. Defenses dissolved. Leaders ran out of choices. People who woke in one country found themselves, by midday, in another political reality altogether. The morning was brief, but it carried the weight of decades. Colonial struggle, civil war, foreign intervention, ideological rivalry, and human endurance all converged in one shrinking window of time, and then the window closed. The final American escape became the largest helicopter evacuation in history. When fixed-wing aircraft could no longer safely use Saigon's main airport, the entire logic of escape changed at once. Helicopters became the last lifeline, and what followed was extraordinary in scale, speed, and tension. Marine aircraft shuttled again and again between the city and ships waiting offshore in the South China Sea. Crews flew through smoke, confusion, and crowds that kept growing as word spread. The operation was not a neat withdrawal from a stable battlefield. It was an airborne bridge built in real time for diplomats, citizens, allied Vietnamese, and others trying to outrun a political collapse. The numbers alone are staggering, but the human picture is even more gripping. Every landing meant more desperate faces, more split-second decisions, and more pressure on crews already flying at the edge of endurance. It became history's largest helicopter evacuation because there was no other way left, and because the end came so fast. A Christmas song on the radio secretly signaled the last evacuation. Few details from the final hours are stranger or more unforgettable than the use of a holiday song in tropical heat to mark the beginning of the last escape. American personnel had arranged a coded signal for the moment when evacuation by helicopter would begin. First came a spoken weather message. Then came White Christmas over the radio. In another setting, it would have sounded cheerful, even silly. In Saigon, it meant time had run out. That contrast gives the moment its eerie power. While the city braced for attack, one of the most familiar songs in the American imagination floated through the air as an instruction to move at once. For those who recognized it, the music did not bring comfort. It brought urgency, fear, and a sharp understanding that the final stage had started. History is full of grand speeches and famous orders. This one arrived disguised as a tune almost everyone already knew by heart. Desperate families climbed rooftops as helicopters thudded over a collapsing capital. For many civilians, the end of Saigon was not experienced through strategy maps or diplomatic cables. It was experienced through stairwells, heat, noise, and the hope that one more aircraft might still arrive. Families moved upward because upward seemed to offer the only remaining chance. Rooftops became waiting rooms, suspended above a city losing its certainty by the minute. Children were carried. Bags were clutched. Papers that proved a connection to Americans or to the South Vietnamese state suddenly mattered with life-changing intensity. The helicopters overhead were not abstract symbols. They were choices made visible. Every seat meant safety for someone and exclusion for someone else. That is why the rooftop scenes remain so powerful. They compress the vast machinery of history into something immediate and human. You can hear the rotors, feel the panic, and sense how an entire capital had narrowed to one question repeated again and again. Will this fight take us to? South Vietnam surrendered just hours after its last foreign protectors flew away. The timing of the surrender gave the end of the war a particularly stark meaning. For years, South Vietnam had relied on outside military power, money, equipment, and political backing to survive. By the final day, that support had narrowed to evacuation. Once the last American helicopters departed, the remaining government stood almost entirely alone before advancing forces that had been closing in for weeks. Only hours later, President Lon Van Min announced a surrender and called on Southern troops to stop fighting. The sequence was brutal in its clarity. First, the foreign shield vanished. Then the state it had long supported gave up the struggle. That order of events helped cement one of the lasting interpretations of the fall. It was not simply a defeat in battle. It was the moment when dependency was exposed beyond denial. The end came so quickly afterward that the connection felt unmistakable to observers both inside Vietnam and across the watching world. The city's fall became one of the Cold War's defining images. Some events remain important because of what they changed on the ground. Others become enduring because they also crystallize an entire age. The Fall of Saigon did both. It condensed the Cold War into scenes that people could instantly understand. A superpower had poured in treasure, weapons, aircraft, advisors, and years of effort. Yet the image that endured was not one of mastery. It was one of departure. That reversal gave the event enormous symbolic force. For many around the world, Saigon became shorthand for the limits of power, the fragility of client states, and the emotional cost of ideological struggle carried into distant lands. It also became a lesson in how history is remembered visually. Maps and policy papers matter, but a helicopter over a rooftop or a tank at a palace can shape memory more deeply than volumes of analysis. That is why the city's fall outgrew Vietnam itself and entered the global imagination as a Cold War turning point. What looked sudden was the final crash of years of unraveling. The end of Saigon can seem abrupt when seen through the famous final day. Yet the collapse was prepared by a long chain of weakening decisions, shrinking options, and battered confidence. The Paris Peace Accords did not produce a lasting peace. North Vietnamese forces remained in the south. American combat troops were gone. Aid from Washington declined. Then came the Spring Offensive of 1975, and with it a series of cascading defeats that destroyed any illusion of stability. Retreats became panicked movements. Cities were abandoned. Command frayed. Morale sank. By the time the world focused on Saigon, much of the outcome had already been shaped elsewhere, over months and even years. That is one reason the finale feels so dramatic. A great deal of hidden strain suddenly became visible all at once. The city did not collapse in isolation. It was the last section of a structure that had been cracking for a very long time, until one final blow brought everything down. Tanks smashed through the presidential palace gates as cameras watched. One of the most iconic moments of the war's end came not from a battlefield deep in the countryside, but from the symbolic heart of South Vietnamese power. When North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of Independence Palace, the image said in seconds what speeches could not. This was not merely an advance. It was the physical breaking open of a government's final shell. The palace had stood for authority, continuity, and the claim that the southern state still existed. Once armored vehicles burst through its entrance, that claim was shattered in the most public way possible. The scene also mattered because cameras were there. The world did not have to imagine the collapse afterward. It saw steel crossing the threshold. It saw victory become visible. In that sense, the gates were more than gates. They were a line between two eras. Once crossed, there was no serious doubt left about who held the capital and what story Vietnam would enter next. The famous rooftop photo was not taken at the embassy. One of the best-known images from the end of the war has been misunderstood for decades. Many people assume it shows evacuees climbing a ladder to an American embassy helicopter. In fact, the photograph was taken at a different building used by the American presence in Saigon, a residential structure associated with the sea. IA. That correction matters because it reveals how memory simplifies. History. The photograph became so famous that it swallowed the details of its own setting. Once people attached the embassy to the image, the mistake hardened into popular truth. Yet the real location is fascinating in its own right. It reminds us that the evacuation spread across multiple sites, not only the embassy compound that later dominated public imagination. It also shows how a single frame can become more powerful than literal accuracy. The picture endures because it captures urgency, ascent, and last chances. Even stripped of the embassy myth, it remains one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. In one astonishing day, a capital changed hands and history. The 30th of April was not memorable only because a city was captured. Capitals have fallen before. What made this day extraordinary was the way political, military, and emotional worlds shifted together with almost unbelievable speed. In a matter of hours, officials who had represented one government were overtaken by another. Radio announcements changed meaning. Flags changed meaning. Streets changed meaning. People who had lived inside one national story suddenly had to understand themselves inside a new one. That is why the day still feels cinematic, yet far more intimate than spectacle alone. Every large change reached down into individual lives. A pilot, a clerk, a mother, a marine, a student, a soldier, each would remember a different turning point, but all were caught in the same sweep. By nightfall, the map looked different. The war was effectively over, and one of the defining dramas of the 20th century had crossed into aftermath. The Paris peace deal left enemy troops inside South Vietnam. When the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, many people hoped the war had finally found its off switch. On paper, the agreement sounded like a path toward peace. American prisoners would return home. American forces would withdraw. a ceasefire would begin. Yet one crucial reality remained in place, and it made the settlement far more fragile than it first appeared. North Vietnamese troops were not required to leave the south. That meant the agreement froze the war without truly ending it. Two rival governments still claimed legitimacy. Armed forces still faced each other across contested ground. The fighting could pause in one district and flare in another. For South Vietnam, this was a dangerous kind of peace, because the threat did not disappear. It simply stayed where it was, waiting. The Accords became famous as diplomacy, but their most startling feature may be how much unresolved war they quietly allowed to remain inside the map. Saigon's collapse accelerated when the spring offensive shattered southern defenses. The final crisis did not begin at the palace gates. It began when North Vietnam launched a major spring offensive in 1975 and struck with a speed that stunned the South. This was not a cautious test. It was a hard, coordinated push that exposed how weak the southern position had become. Defenses that once seemed capable of holding for months began breaking in rapid succession. Units pulled back. Commanders made hurried decisions. Entire provinces slipped away. Just as important, the offensive damaged confidence as much as territory. Once soldiers and civilians sensed that the line was no longer stable, fear began to outrun the battlefield itself. Rumors spread faster than orders. Retreats became contagious. The question stopped being whether Saigon could endure indefinitely. The question became how soon the pressure would reach the capital. That is what made the spring offensive so decisive. It did not merely win ground. It transformed a troubled war into a fast-moving collapse. Cities fell so quickly that entire retreat routes turned into chaos. As the South Vietnamese position unraveled, some of the most dramatic scenes did not happen in final stands, but on the roads. When commanders ordered withdrawals from major regions in the Central Highlands and along the coast, huge numbers of soldiers and civilians moved at once. Highways filled with military vehicles, buses, carts, and families on foot. The intention was retreat. The reality was collapse in motion. Equipment clogged the roads. Discipline weakened. Panic spread from one convoy to the next. In some places, enemy pressure hit people already trapped in these streams of movement. What should have been organized redeployment turned into confusion on a massive scale. The roads themselves became symbols of a state losing its shape. A retreat can preserve an army if it is orderly. These retreats often did the opposite. They burned morale, abandoned supplies, and showed everyone watching that control was slipping away faster than leaders could admit. Saigon felt nearer because the roots behind it were breaking first. Da Nang's collapse warned Saigon that the end was racing closer. Da Nang was not just another city. It was one of South Vietnam's largest urban centers, a major port, a military hub, and a place many assumed could hold far longer than smaller provincial capitals. When it fell in late March of 1975, the shock traveled straight to Saigon. If Da Nang could not be stabilized, then confidence in the entire southern war effort took a devastating blow. The collapse also revealed how badly the government was failing to manage retreat, reinforcement, and civilian flight. Crowds surged toward escape routes. Military organization thinned. The city became a warning written in real time. Leaders in Saigon could now see that the crisis was no longer distant or containable. A northern city had fallen with alarming speed, and one of the country's most important strongpoints had not saved itself. That changed the mental map of the war. The capital was still standing, but the horizon had narrowed, and the clock suddenly felt much louder. South Vietnam faced ammunition shortages, fuel problems, and failing morale. Wars are often remembered through dramatic offensives and famous last stands, yet states can also die from shortages that seem almost mundane. By the final stage of the conflict, South Vietnam was struggling with exactly those quiet forms of weakness. Ammunition became scarcer. Fuel was harder to secure. Aircraft and vehicles could not be used as freely as before. Artillery support could not always answer enemy pressure with the same force. These limits changed what commanders were willing to attempt and what troops believed they could survive. Material scarcity also had a psychological effect. Soldiers notice when shells are rationed. Pilots notice when fuel is precious. Civilians notice when confidence drains from official speech. Morale rarely collapses in a single instant. It thins gradually, then suddenly appears gone. That is part of what makes this stage of the war so gripping. The downfall was shaped not only by enemy strength, but by the slow erosion of the very resources that make resistance feel possible. President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned days before Saigon itself collapsed. Only a week before the capital fell, President Nguyen Van Thieu stepped down from office in a moment thick with exhaustion, bitterness, and political drama. He had led South Vietnam through years of war, dependence on American support, and deep internal strain. Now, as defeat approached, he left the presidency instead of presiding over the final collapse. His resignation mattered because it signaled more than a change of leadership. It told the country that the center of power no longer believed it could command events. In wartime, leadership is also theater. It projects continuity, purpose, and control. Once Thieu resigned, that performance cracked in public view. The move also raised a question that hovered over the last days of the Republic. Was this an effort to open a path toward negotiation, or simply a final act in a government already running out of time? Either way, the exit felt historic because the state itself seemed to be resigning alongside its president. His farewell speech blamed allies as the Republic slipped away. When Nguyen Van Thieu addressed the nation before leaving office, he did more than announce his departure. He delivered an indictment. His speech burned with resentment toward the United States, which he believed had abandoned South Vietnam after years of promises and sacrifice. The anger was striking because it surfaced at the exact moment when the Republic was nearing its end. Instead of offering only solemn reflection, he placed blame before history had even settled. That gave the speech a special force. It sounded like the voice of a collapsing state trying to explain its own ruin while the walls were still shaking. Thieu accused America of failing to provide the support needed to survive against the North. Whether listeners agreed or not, the speech revealed the depth of disillusionment inside the alliance. For years, South Vietnam had depended on American power. Now, its departing president used his last great platform to say that dependence had ended in betrayal. Few farewell speeches carry such raw political grief. Power changed hands in Saigon even before the city changed flags. Before the tanks entered the palace, and before the new banners rose over the capital, authority inside Saigon was already shifting in rapid and revealing ways. As defeat drew close, the presidency passed from Nguyen Van Thieu to Tran Van Hong, and then soon after to Duong Van Minh. These changes were not signs of healthy constitutional continuity. They were emergency moves made under crushing pressure, with the city's future hanging by hours rather than months. That is what makes them so fascinating. The state was trying to rearrange itself, while the ground beneath it gave way. Each transfer carried hopes that a different leader might negotiate, calm the situation, or make surrender less catastrophic. Yet each change also advertised weakness. When power moves too quickly at the top, everyone below senses the storm. Saigon's political center was therefore collapsing in stages even before military defeat became final. The flags had not changed yet, but the old order was already loosening its grip. Duan Van Minh became president only at the very end. Duan Van Minh entered the presidency under circumstances so late and dramatic that his tenure has the feel of a final scene rather than a real administration. Known to many as Big Min, he was a familiar figure in South Vietnamese politics and military life, especially because of his role in the coup that overthrew NGO Dinh Diem years earlier. By April 1975, he returned to the top not as a triumphant leader, but as a man chosen for an ending. Some believed he might be more acceptable as a negotiating figure than the leaders before him. Others simply saw no better option left. That makes his rise deeply revealing. In the Republic's last hours, the country turned to a known name from an earlier chapter, as though history itself was circling back while the state ran out of room. He became president when victory was no longer plausible. His office was not really a beginning. It was the final doorway before surrender. He would soon become the man who formally surrendered South Vietnam. Duong Van Minh's presidency lasted such a short time that it is remembered almost entirely for one act. He became the man who formally ended the war for South Vietnam. On the morning of the 30th of April, as North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon, Minh broadcast an order calling on Southern troops to stop fighting. That decision fixed his place in history forever. He was not the architect of the Republic, nor its long-term guardian, nor the leader who had defined its central years. Yet he became the voice that closed it. There is something remarkable in that. Great political careers are often remembered for decades of policy or struggle. Minh is remembered for a few words spoken at the hinge of a nation's fate. His surrender was not merely administrative. It was symbolic, moral, and deeply human. One man, briefly holding power, had to pronounce the end of a state that millions had lived inside for 20 years. American planners had rehearsed evacuation scenarios long before the collapse. Long before the final helicopters lifted from Saigon, American officials had already imagined the possibility that everything might end in a rushed departure. Contingency planning had become part of the war's hidden architecture. Diplomats, military officers, intelligence staff, and transport specialists studied how to move people out if the capital became unsafe. That preparation is fascinating because it reveals a double reality at the heart of American policy. Publicly, support for South Vietnam still implied endurance. Privately, planners were working through the mechanics of failure. Routes were considered. Assembly points were identified. Lists were drawn up. Categories of evacuees had to be defined in advance, because there would never be enough time to invent the system once panic began. These plans did not mean Washington knew exactly when Saigon would fall. They meant experienced officials understood that collapse was possible, and that history sometimes arrives faster than confidence, speeches, or hope are willing to admit. The final emergency plan carried the oddly gentle name, Frequent Wind. There is something almost surreal about the name chosen for the last great evacuation of Saigon. Operation Frequent Wind sounds soft, almost harmless, like weather passing through leaves. Yet behind that mild phrase stood one of the most dramatic emergency airlifts in modern history. The contrast is part of what makes it so memorable. Military operations often carry names that feel bold or severe. This one sounded calm while preparing for catastrophe. Once activated, it meant American helicopters would begin lifting people out of a collapsing capital as enemy forces closed in. The name also reveals how bureaucracies wrap immense human drama in language that seems strangely ordinary. Beneath those two quiet words were pilots, Marines, diplomats, refugees, and desperate calculations about time, fuel, security, and survival. History is full of moments when official language fails to match emotional reality. This is one of the finest examples. A city was nearing the end of its era, and the final script was called Frequent Wind. Evacuation first relied on airplanes, not helicopters above the embassy. Popular memory often begins with the embassy roof, yet the evacuation of Saigon did not start there. At first, the preferred method was fixed-wing aircraft operating from Tan Son Nhut Airport. That detail matters because it changes the scale of the story. Airplanes could move large numbers far more efficiently than helicopters, and for a time, they did exactly that. Thousands of Americans, Vietnamese, and foreign nationals were flown out before the final emergency phase began. This earlier movement feels less cinematic than rooftop rescues, but it was crucial. It shows that the end unfolded in stages, and that the famous final images came only after more conventional escape routes were damaged or closed. The airport was the first great artery out of the city. Only when it became unusable did the helicopters inherit their legendary role. So the story begins not with hovering aircraft above a staircase, but with runways, transport planes, and a narrowing race against a collapsing timetable. More than 50,000 people flew out before the runway failed. Before helicopter evacuation became the defining image of Saigon's end, an astonishing number of people had already escaped by air. More than 50,000 were flown out during the final phase of departures. A scale so large, it can almost disappear behind the more famous rooftop scenes. Yet this earlier exodus is extraordinary in its own right. It meant that pilots, planners, ground crews, and officials were moving a vast human tide, while the city's future darkened by the hour. Families left with hurriedly gathered possessions. Officials carried documents and uncertainty. Children, aid workers, embassy staff, and military personnel all passed through an air bridge that still functioned, though not for long. What makes this so gripping is the sense of temporary possibility. For a brief window, the runway still offered a path out, and thousands managed to pass through it before violence shut it down. The later helicopter drama is unforgettable, but this first airborne escape was already immense. Artillery and air attack turned Tan Son in Tut into a dead end. Tan Son Nhut was supposed to remain the main exit from Saigon. Instead, it became proof that the city's options were collapsing in real time. On the 29th of April, the airport came under heavy attack from artillery and from aircraft flown by forces aligned with the North. The assault did more than damage runways and buildings. It destroyed the assumption that large-scale evacuation by airplane could continue. Once the airbase became too dangerous for fixed-wing operations, the entire logic of escape had to change immediately. That is what makes the attack so important. It was not merely another battlefield strike. It slammed shut the most efficient door out of the capital. People who might have left by plane now depended on helicopters, and helicopters could never carry everyone. In that moment, infrastructure turned into destiny. A runway that had symbolized movement became a trap, and the city's remaining hours suddenly felt much tighter and far more unforgiving. Captured South Vietnamese planes were used against Saigon's own airbase. One of the most startling twists in Saigon's final hours came from the sky. Aircraft that had once belonged to South Vietnam were captured, then flown back against Tan Son Nhut in support of the offensive closing around the capital. There is something deeply unsettling in that reversal. Machines once meant to defend the state were turned into tools for helping end it. The attack carried practical force, but it also carried symbolic power. It showed how rapidly the South's military system was being broken apart and repurposed by its enemies. Weapons do not simply vanish when armies collapse. They change hands, and when they do, the psychological effect can be enormous. For those in Saigon, this was not only an airstrike. It was a visible sign that the boundaries between possession and loss had already been breached. Even the Republic's own aircraft could return wearing a new meaning. Few images capture military collapse more sharply than that. After the airport was hit, helicopters became the only way out. Once fixed-wing flights could no longer safely operate from Tan Son Nhu, the evacuation entered its most famous and most dangerous phase. Helicopters were no longer a backup. They became the sole remaining bridge between the city and the ships waiting offshore. That shift changed everything. Airplanes had offered capacity and speed. Helicopters offered flexibility, but at a much smaller scale and with far more visible strain. Suddenly, rooftops mattered. Embassy compounds mattered. Traffic on the ground mattered. Each landing zone became a precious patch of possibility in a city that was running out of both time and order. This is one reason the final evacuation has such emotional force. It feels improvised, intimate, and fragile, even though it rested on massive military effort. The moment the airport ceased to function, Saigon's escape route rose into the air above the streets. From then on, survival depended on rotas, coordination, and the hope that one more flight would still come. American carriers waited offshore like floating exits from another world. Beyond the coastline, the American fleet became the hidden stage on which Saigon's evacuation would end. Aircraft carriers and other ships waited in the South China Sea, ready to receive helicopters packed with evacuees and crew. To people leaving the city, these ships must have seemed almost unreal. After panic, heat, and uncertainty on land, the decks offshore offered a strange new world of order, steel, and temporary safety. Yet even there, the drama did not stop. Flight decks had to be cleared, arrivals had to be processed, and the pace never relaxed for long. The carriers were not simply passive destinations. They were active machines of rescue, absorbing wave after wave of human displacement. That is what makes them so fascinating in this story. They stood just beyond sight of the city for many onshore, but they were essential to everything that followed. Saigon's last path outward did not end at a border. It ended on floating airfields at sea. Marine helicopters lifted people from streets, rooftops, and embassy grounds. During Operation Frequent Wind, Marine helicopter crews flew into one of the most charged urban evacuations of the 20th century. Their missions drew them to locations that have since become legendary, yet each landing was also intensely practical and dangerous. Some pickups happened inside the embassy compound. Others came from rooftops or designated sites scattered across the city. These were not empty spaces waiting in calm order. They were crowded, emotional, and full of people whose futures might depend on a few seconds of decision. Pilots had to judge approach angles, security risks, fuel, weight, and timing, while pressure mounted everywhere around them. Marines on the ground had to hold order where order was hardest to keep. That combination of technical skill and human tension is what gives these flights their lasting grip on the imagination. They were rescue missions, but they were also moving intersections between military precision and raw civilian desperation, played out above a capital in its final convulsive hours. The evacuation kept flying through darkness as the city held its breath. As night fell over Saigon, the evacuation did not end. It continued beneath darkness, with helicopters moving between the city and the fleet, while uncertainty deepened and exhaustion spread. Night operations always carry their own tension, even in calm conditions. In a collapsing capital, they become even more charged. Visibility narrows. Landmarks blur. Time feels stranger. For those waiting below, every distant rotor sound could inspire hope or dread. For those already aboard aircraft, The city below must have seemed to recede into shadow even as its significance grew larger. The continuation of flights after dark is one of the most gripping features of the story, because it shows how total the effort had become. There was no clean stopping point, no graceful conclusion before sunset. The work pressed onward into the night because history was still moving, and there were still people left to move with it. Saigon did not sleep. It waited, listened, and held on. A coded weather message told listeners the final phase had begun. In the last hours before Saigon fell, the signal that set the final evacuation in motion did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a routine radio announcement about the weather. That was the brilliance and the eeriness of it. A plain sentence could pass through the air without stirring panic among everyone listening. Yet for those who knew the code, it meant the clock had reached its final minute. Secret instructions often seemed dramatic in films. Here, the reality was stranger because it was so ordinary on the surface. A city was nearing political extinction, and the message that unlocked the final rescue arrived, disguised as something almost forgettable. That contrast gives the moment its power. History did not always announce itself with trumpets or artillery. Sometimes it entered by radio in a voice that sounded calm, controlled, and entirely practical, while those who understood it suddenly knew that departure was no longer a plan. It was now. Then White Christmas floated through tropical heat as an evacuation signal. After the coded weather phrase came the part people never forget. White Christmas began playing across a hot city under enormous strain, and a beloved holiday song became a command to move. The contrast is almost too perfect to invent. Snow, sleigh bells, and winter longing drifted through the air above palm trees, exhaust, fear, and crowds waiting for rescue. For Americans in Saigon who knew the plan, the music meant the final helicopter evacuation had started. There is something haunting in the way culture and crisis collided in that instant. A song built from nostalgia and seasonal comfort suddenly carried urgency and finality. It turned memory into procedure. It also gave the moment a strange emotional texture that ordinary military language could never have created. People were not summoned by sirens. They were summoned by a tune associated with home. That helped make the signal unforgettable, because it fused danger, distance, and longing into one surreal sound. The song sounded absurd, eerie, and unforgettable in a city under siege. Part of what makes the radio signal so powerful is not just that it was unusual, but that it felt almost wrong for the moment. Saigon was tense, crowded, and closing in on catastrophe. Against that background, White Christmas must have landed like something from another planet. That sense of absurdity is exactly why it lingered in memory. War often produces moments where reality seems to break its own tone, and this was one of them. A city expecting shellfire and surrender instead heard a polished American standard about winter. The emotional effect was complicated. For some, it may have brought a flash of home. For others, it likely sharpened a sense of separation from ordinary life. And for those who understood the code, the strangeness only deepened the dread. A cheerful melody had become the soundtrack for final departure. The song endures in memory because it captured the surreal nature of endings, when familiar things suddenly carry meanings they were never meant to hold. Embassy guards destroyed documents while thousands gathered outside the compound. Inside the American embassy, one drama unfolded in paper, fire, and urgency, while another swelled beyond the walls. As crowds pressed outside, guards and staff worked to destroy sensitive documents before the compound could be overrun or abandoned. This detail fascinates because it reveals how endings operate on several levels at once. Out in the streets, people were thinking about survival, transport, and whether their names might get them inside. Within the embassy, Officials were thinking about secrets, codes, files, contacts, and the dangerous afterlife of information. The distraction of records was not a side note. It was part of the final logic of retreat. States do not only move bodies when they withdraw. They also erase traces, protect networks, and decide what must not be left behind. That makes the embassy feel less like a simple refuge and more like the last working chamber of a government presence, still managing intelligence and risk, even as the world outside the gates surged with fear. Many Vietnamese with ties to America feared deadly retribution if left. For countless South Vietnamese, the end of Saigon was not just a political change. It was a personal reckoning charged with fear. Translators, clerks, drivers, military officers, intelligence contacts, and officials connected to the American presence had strong reason to believe they might face imprisonment, persecution, or worse, if their dear remained. That fear gave the evacuation much of its emotional force. It was never only about extracting foreigners. It was also about the people whose lives had become entwined with an alliance that was now collapsing. Many had spent years building careers, identities, and loyalties around the southern state and its American backing. When that world began to vanish, they faced a brutal question. Could they get out before the new order arrived with its own judgments? This is why the final days still carry such moral weight. Behind every request for passage stood a biography. People were not merely fleeing a city. They were trying to outrun the consequences of having belonged to the losing side. The embassy became a symbol because it looked like the last door. In practical terms, the embassy was only one site in a much larger evacuation. In symbolic terms, it became something far greater. As the crisis tightened, it came to represent the final threshold between danger and escape. That was partly because it was visible, fortified, and unmistakably American. But it was also because symbols grow where hope narrows. When people believed most other options were disappearing, the embassy seemed like the last remaining opening in a wall that was closing fast. This is why it entered global memory so powerfully. The building stood for more than diplomacy. It stood for promises, protection, abandonment, and final chances all at once. Once crowds gathered at its gates, the image almost wrote itself. Here was the heart of a superpower's presence, surrounded by those desperate to be admitted before the end. Even people who never saw the compound in person came to understand it as the place where history asked who would be let through. People brought children, suitcases, papers, and hopes to evacuation points. At the evacuation points, history became tangible in the things people carried. Children were lifted, guided, or held close. Suitcases appeared with clothes, keepsakes, or hurriedly chosen necessities. Papers mattered with almost sacred intensity, because the right letter, pass, or identity document might mean entry where pleading alone could not. Those details matter because they reveal how enormous events are lived through ordinary objects. A war's ending can be measured in treaties and troop movements, but it can also be measured in what a family decides to take when there is room for almost nothing. Some brought proof of employment. Some carried addresses, photographs, or official stamps. Some likely carried the wrong things, because fear does not always choose rationally. That is part of what makes the scene so compelling. The evacuation points were not abstract locations on a map. They were gathering places where private lives were condensed into whatever could be held in arms, pockets, or one small case. Some evacuees were chosen by lists that could never fit everyone. Behind the visible chaos of the evacuation stood a quieter and more painful system of selection. Lists determined who had priority, who had authorization, and who might reach a helicopter or transport before the final door closed. That detail is gripping because it reveals the cold administrative heart inside human desperation. Names on paper became destiny, or at least the nearest thing to it. Yet no list could ever solve the deeper problem, because there were always more people at risk than space available. Every name included implied another omitted. That is why these lists hold the story. They were necessary, but they were also cruel in the way all limited rescue systems become cruel under pressure. Bureaucracy, which usually feels dull and distant, turned intimate and life-altering. A typed page, a handwritten note, a checked name, a missing name, these small acts of record-keeping carried astonishing moral weight when the city's remaining hours were draining away. The final hours forced impossible choices between loyalty, family, and survival. One reason the Fall of Saigon continues to grip the imagination is that its hardest moments were not only military or political. They were personal in ways almost anyone can feel. People had to decide whether to stay with relatives who lacked papers, whether to obey official duty or abandon it, whether to wait for someone delayed or seize the chance to escape alone. Those are the kinds of decisions that never feel fully right, no matter what is chosen. In calmer times, loyalty, family, and survival may seem aligned. In a collapsing capital, they can pull in opposite directions with terrifying force. That tension gives the final hours much of their lasting emotional depth. Heroism did not always look grand. Sometimes it looked like letting someone else board first. Sometimes it looked like refusing to leave a parent. Sometimes it looked like making a choice that would later ache forever. This was history at its most intimate, because it entered the space where love and fear meet. Even successful escapes often began with heartbreak on a crowded roof. The people who got out are often remembered as the fortunate ones, and of course many were. Yet even survival could begin in pain sharp enough to mark a lifetime. Crowded roofs were places of rescue, but also of separation, uncertainty, and scenes that could wound memory long after safety was reached. There were people left behind below. There were names not called, relatives missing, children passed between adults, and last glances taken with no promise of reunion. That is what gives these escapes such emotional complexity. They were victories over immediate danger, but they were rarely clean or joyful in the moment. A helicopter lifting away could mean relief and grief at once. It could carry a person toward life while leaving family, home, language, and identity in sudden suspension. The roof therefore becomes more than a dramatic setting. It becomes the place where escape revealed its true cost. Getting out did not erase loss. It often made that loss unmistakably real. The most famous helicopter photo shows a CIA-linked building, not the embassy. One of the most familiar images from the end of the Vietnam War is also one of the most widely misidentified. The photograph, so often described as an embassy rooftop scene, was actually taken at an apartment building used by the American presence in Saigon, a site linked to the CIA. That mistake matters because it shows how legends form around photographs faster than facts can follow. Once the image spread across newspapers and magazines, people attached it to the embassy because the embassy had already become the central symbol of the evacuation. Yet the real setting tells a richer story. The evacuation was larger, messier, and more dispersed than popular memory sometimes allows. Multiple buildings, multiple pickup points, and multiple kinds of American institutions were entangled in the final escape. The staircase in that photograph does not lose power when the location is corrected. In some ways it gains it, because it reminds us that history is often more complicated than the version the world first remembers. Photographer Hubert Van Es captured a staircase that became world history. Hubert Van Es did not set out to create a myth. He was a photographer trying to record a city in its last hours before falling. Yet the frame he captured became one of those rare images that seem to absorb an entire era into a single view. What makes the photograph so powerful is its structure. A bare rooftop, a ladder, a small helicopter, a line of figures climbing upward. Nothing in the composition is grand in the traditional sense. There is no explosion, no battlefield charge, no sweeping panorama. Instead, there is ascent, urgency, and the sense that history has narrowed to a staircase. That restraint is exactly why the image endures. It lets viewers feel the tension without needing explanation. Everyone can understand what it means to climb toward a last chance. Van Ees caught not just a moment, but a form that human beings instantly recognize. The picture became world history because it turned a complex ending into a shape the eye could never forget. That single image came to symbolize defeat, rescue, panic, and abandonment. Great historical photographs often survive because they hold more than one meaning at once. The rooftop image from Saigon does exactly that. To some viewers, it speaks of rescue because people are clearly reaching for a way out. To others, it signals panic because the climb looks urgent and compressed. It also came to symbolize defeat, especially in the United States, where the war's ending was already wrapped in arguments about power, sacrifice, and failure. And for many Vietnamese, the image could suggest abandonment because the very existence of that line implied that not everyone would leave. This is what gives the picture such extraordinary emotional depth. It refuses to settle into one simple message. It can be read as salvation and as loss in the same glance. Few images carry such contradictory truths so naturally. That is why the photograph kept widening in meaning over time. It never merely showed an evacuation. It showed what endings do to the people caught inside them. Another unforgettable image shows helicopters shoved into the sea for space. If the rooftop photograph captures the desperation of getting out, another image captures the desperate improvisation of receiving those who made it to the fleet. On the decks of American ships offshore, helicopters arrived so steadily that crews sometimes had to push aircraft overboard to clear landing space for the next wave. It is one of those details that sounds almost unbelievable until you picture the urgency. Perfectly usable machines, expensive and powerful, were treated as disposable because human lives mattered more in that moment than hardware. That image has such force because it dramatizes the logic of emergency with startling clarity. Under normal conditions, aircraft are protected, serviced, counted, and preserved. Here, they were shoved into the sea because the next landing could carry more evacuees. The ocean itself became part of the evacuations machinery, swallowing helicopters so the rescue could continue. It is a scene of waste, only in material terms. In moral terms, it reveals just how absolute the priorities had become. Pilots dumped aircraft overboard so more evacuees could land aboard carriers. Some of the most traumatic choices in the evacuation were made not in government offices, but on flight decks by people confronting immediate limits. South Vietnamese pilots flew helicopters to American ships carrying families and refugees, often with no promise that there would be room for both passengers and aircraft. Once the evacuees were offloaded, crews sometimes pushed those helicopters into the sea. The act was startling, but it followed a hard and urgent logic. Every aircraft left sitting on deck occupied space that might soon be needed by another incoming helicopter carrying more people. So the machines were sacrificed to keep the human flow moving. That detail gives the scene a raw, almost mythic quality. Men had flown across water seeking a final refuge, landed on a foreign deck, and watched the vehicle that saved them disappear into the ocean so that others might follow. Few wartime moments reveal the hierarchy of values so plainly. Metal was expendable. Time was scarce. people came first. The airlift produced photographs that still define how the war is remembered. Many wars leave behind archives of reports, maps, and speeches, yet only a few leave images so strong that they shape memory for generations. The airlift from Saigon did exactly that. Photographs from those final days still stand at the center of how millions imagine the end of the Vietnam War. They do not merely illustrate events after the fact. They organize remembrance itself. Helicopters on rooftops, crowds at compounds, and aircraft on carrier decks became the visual grammar of the war's ending. That matters because memory is rarely built from facts alone. It is built from scenes people can replay in the mind. The airlift produced those scenes in abundance. It gave history shapes, angles, and faces that no summary could replace. Long after people forgot dates, commanders, or policy arguments, the photographs remained. They still carry the feeling of urgency, compression, and irreversible change. In that sense, the evacuation was not only a rescue effort, it was also the creation of the war's lasting visual afterlife. Journalists watched one of the 20th century's most photographed endings. The Fall of Saigon unfolded before an extraordinary concentration of cameras, correspondence, and international attention. That alone makes it unusual. Many historical endings are poorly seen at the time, then reconstructed later through fragments. Saigon was different. Journalists were there, watching the capital unravel in near real time, trying to record an ending that the whole world suspected would matter far beyond Vietnam. Their presence changed the historical texture of the event. It meant that evacuation scenes, collapsing authority, and the final symbols of surrender were captured from multiple angles and sent outward almost immediately. This did not make the moment less chaotic. It made the chaos globally visible. The 20th century produced many famous crises, but few final days were photographed with such intensity while they were happening. That is part of why the fall feels so immediate even now. It was not hidden behind distance. It arrived through lenses, captions, deadlines, and dispatches that helped turn a local collapse into a worldwide spectacle of history. The Fall of Saigon became both a military event and a media event. Armies closed in, governments collapsed, and evacuation plans raced against time. Yet the end of Saigon was never only a matter of military movement. It was also an event of transmission. Images, reports, and interpretations spread outward as the crisis unfolded, which meant the world did not simply learn what had happened afterward. It watched meaning being built in real time. This double character makes the moment especially fascinating. Tanks and helicopters shaped the physical outcome, but cameras and headlines shaped the emotional and political legacy. The military event ended a war. The media event defined how that ending would be seen, argued over, and remembered. These two layers did not exist separately. They fed one another. A dramatic scene on the ground gained further power because it was photographed. A photograph gained deeper resonance because the ground situation was already so historic. That is why the Fall of Saigon remained such a modern ending. It was fought, witnessed, and narrated all at once. Images from those rooftops outlived speeches, communiques, and official explanations. Governments speak constantly during war. They issue statements, denials, assurances, strategies, and final explanations. Yet when people remember Saigon, it is usually not the language they recall first. It is the imagery. That tells us something profound about how public memory works. Speeches depend on trust, context, and patient listening. Images can strike immediately and endure almost without permission. The rooftop scenes from Saigon outlasted official words because they seemed to reveal something direct and undeniable. A line of people climbing upward toward a helicopter needed no policy briefing to become meaningful. It carried the emotional truth of departure in a form too simple to ignore. Over time, the photographs kept speaking even as arguments about the war shifted around them. Presidents, diplomats, and analysts all tried to interpret the ending, but the rooftops remained more persuasive than any of them. They became the memory that survived the debate because the eye accepted what the ear might still resist. Few wartime photographs have carried so much history in one frame. Some photographs are memorable because they are beautiful. Others endure because they are shocking. The most powerful do something harder. They hold an entire historical condition inside one bounded image. The famous Saigon rooftop frame belongs in that rare category. In one view, it contains imperial aftermath, failed policy, civilian fear, bureaucratic urgency, technological rescue, and the collapse of a long alliance. It also contains a basic human drama that reaches beyond its setting. People are climbing toward uncertainty because staying below feels worse. That is a story almost anyone can grasp at once, even without knowing the politics of Vietnam. The photograph therefore works on several levels at the same time. It is specific enough to belong to one day in one city, yet broad enough to stand for endings everywhere. That is why it has carried so much history for so long. It does not merely record the fall of Saigon. It distills the meaning of that fall into one unforgettable act of ascent. 2 American Marines died in the last rocket attack of the war. The final American deaths in Vietnam did not occur in some distant jungle or in a climactic set piece designed for history books. They came in a rocket attack on Tan Son Nhut Air Base as the evacuation crisis reached its breaking point. That detail gives the moment a terrible sharpness. After years of fighting, negotiations, withdrawals, and public declarations that the war was winding down, the last American lives lost there were taken during the chaotic endgame around Saigon's airport. It reminds us that wars do not always conclude with ceremony. Sometimes they close with one more burst of violence that feels almost unbearably cruel because it arrives so near the finish. The attack also underscored how dangerous the capital had become. Even as officials tried to move people out, the ground beneath the evacuation itself was still under fire. The war's ending was not peaceful in its final breath. It was still lethal, still sudden, and still capable of taking more. They were Charles M.C. Mahon and Darwin Judge, the war's last American dead. History often compresses immense events into a few names, and in the case of America's final war dead in Vietnam, those names were Charles M.C. Mahon and Darwin Judge. Remembering them matters because it rescues the ending from abstraction. The last American deaths were not a statistic drifting at the edge of a timeline. They were 2 young Marines, 2 individual lives, each with a family, a past, and a future that would never arrive. That is what gives this fact its weight. Enormous national stories can become so large that they seem to lose their human edges. Names bring those edges back. N.C. Mahon and Judge stand at the final threshold of American loss in Vietnam, not because they were the only ones who mattered, but because history placed them at the very end of a long roll of sacrifice. Their names remain because they mark the point where a generation of American deaths in that war finally stopped, and silence followed. Their deaths came only hours before the last helicopter finally lifted away. What makes the deaths of Charles M.C. Mahon and Darwin Judge especially haunting is the closeness in time to the final American departure. They were killed only hours before the last helicopter left Saigon. That narrow gap gives the moment an almost unbearable tension. The war was so close to ending for the United States that people could nearly feel the door swinging shut, yet violence still reached through it. This is one of the cruelest patterns in history. Even when a conflict is visibly ending, danger does not politely step aside. he can strike at the very edge of escape. Their deaths therefore sit in the story like a dark echo of the evacuation itself. While helicopters carried people toward safety, the final cost of staying even a little longer remained brutally real. The war's last American dead were not buried deep in its middle years. They were claimed at the threshold when everyone already sensed the ending and still could not outrun it. The final embassy guards waited until almost everyone else was gone. As the evacuation narrowed toward its last moments, the men guarding the American embassy faced a role that was both practical and symbolic. They stayed while wave after wave of others departed, holding position until almost everyone else who could be moved had been moved. That kind of duty carries a special tension. Guards at the end of an evacuation are not merely protecting a building. They are protecting the final order of events. They buy time, preserve discipline, and stand between a controlled withdrawal and complete breakdown. In Saigon, that role felt especially charged because the embassy had become such a potent symbol. Remaining behind there meant inhabiting the very image of America's shrinking presence. As others lifted away, the guards stayed with the noise, the waiting, and the knowledge that their own turn would come last. That is part of why their position still captures the imagination. They stood at the final edge of departure, holding the shape of an ending until it was almost over. Ambassador Graham Martin resisted leaving until the evacuation's very last stretch. Graham Martin, the American ambassador in Saigon, became one of the most striking personalities of the final evacuation because he resisted leaving until the very last phase. His reluctance was not a trivial matter of temperament. It reflected the burden of diplomacy at the point where diplomacy was collapsing. To depart too early could seem like admitting defeat before the last possible moment. To remain too long risked complicating the evacuation itself. Martin embodied that tension. He had spent years representing American commitment to South Vietnam, and stepping onto a helicopter meant acknowledging in public what events had already made plain. That is why his delay feels so historically charged. It was a final act of symbolism by a man whose office had always traded in symbols as much as in policy. By the time he finally left, the gesture had become inseparable from the story of Saigon's end. The ambassador did not simply depart a city. He departed an entire era of American presence. Some Americans chose to stay even as the mission officially ended. The evacuation did not carry every American away. A small number stayed behind by choice, which adds a fascinating and often overlooked layer to the story. Their decisions remind us that historical endings are never as tidy as the official narrative suggests. Even after the mission formally ended and the final departures were underway, not everyone connected to the American presence agreed that leaving was the only path. Some remained because of personal ties, conviction, unfinished obligations, or a belief that their future could still be made in Vietnam under new realities. That choice stands in sharp contrast to the dominant image of hurried escape. While helicopters symbolized departure, these individuals embodied another possibility, one far quieter and more uncertain. To stay in a conquered capital after the collapse of one side required a different kind of courage, or perhaps a different kind of faith. Their presence complicates the ending in the best historical way. It shows that even great withdrawals leave behind human exceptions. Hundreds of third country nationals were still left at the embassy. Among the most sobering details of the final evacuation is that even after enormous effort, hundreds of third country nationals were still left at the embassy. These were not Americans, and not always Vietnamese either, but foreign nationals from other places who had also been caught in the collapse. Their presence reveals how international Saigon had become by the war's end. The city was not only a Vietnamese battleground or an American outpost. It was a crossroads of diplomats, workers, families, aid personnel, and people whose lives had become entangled with the conflict from many different directions. That is what makes this fact so striking. Even at the climactic end, the cast of history was broader than popular memory often admits. The unfinished evacuation of these people also shows the hard limits of even the largest rescue effort. However vast the machinery, there were still those it could not fully gather. The ending was global in reach and incomplete in execution. The last Marines departed after midnight, closing America's longest war chapter. There is something powerful about the fact that the final Marines left after midnight. The hour itself gives the ending a ceremonial feel, as though one day and one national chapter were both slipping away together in darkness. By that point, the American presence in Saigon had been reduced to its last protective shell. When those Marines finally departed, it marked more than the evacuation of a few remaining personnel. It marked the closing movement of America's long war in Vietnam, a conflict that had stretched across presidencies, protests, casualties, and years of division at home and abroad. Midnight sharpened the symbolism. The departure did not happen under bright daylight with speeches and flags. It happened in the deep hour when things end quietly, decisively, and without illusion. That is part of why the moment still resonates. The war did not conclude for the United States with a parade or triumphant proclamation. It closed with Marines boarding helicopters in darkness and a chapter of history shutting behind them. For the United States, the end looked less like victory than extraction. Nations often prefer to narrate war through the language of triumph, even when reality is far murkier. In Saigon, the final American image allowed little room for such language. What the world saw was not victory, but extraction. People were being removed, not installed. The presence was shrinking, not consolidating. That distinction matters because it shaped the emotional legacy of the war in the United States. Military power was still enormous. Aircraft carriers still waited offshore. Marines still guarded the embassy. Yet none of that translated into a victorious ending. Instead, the visual grammar of the moment was departure, urgency, and salvage. Extraction is such a revealing word because it suggests removal from danger after something has gone wrong. It carries necessity, but not celebration. This is one reason the Fall of Saigon remained so painful in American memory. It forced a superpower to appear not as the master of events, but as a force trying to pull itself and its partners out before the final collapse closed in. The final flight out became a haunting answer to years of intervention. For more than a decade, American involvement in Vietnam had been justified with arguments about containment, credibility, commitment, and the shape of the global future. Then, at the end, one helicopter lifting away from Saigon seemed to answer all those years of intervention with an image far more eloquent than any debate. It did not explain everything, but it concentrated the central question. What had all the power, sacrifice, planning, and destruction finally achieved? The final flight out haunts memory because it feels like history passing judgment without saying a word. There was no neat resolution in that ascent, only departure, distance, and the visible end of an ambition that had once claimed such vast importance. That is why the image still stirs such strong feeling. It became a kind of verdict, even if different viewers drew different lessons from it. After years of speeches about purpose and destiny, the last answer rose into the air on spinning blades and disappeared into the dark. North Vietnamese forces did not simply surround Saigon, they entered decisively. By the final morning, the struggle for Saigon was no longer a matter of distant encirclement or speculative maps. North Vietnamese forces were moving into the capital with speed and purpose, passing from the outskirts into the political center of the southern state. That transition matters because there is a great difference between pressure and possession. A city can endure a siege for weeks and still imagine survival. Once enemy columns begin entering its streets, imagination collapses into reality. In Saigon, that reality arrived fast. Roads that had carried civilian life now carried the force that would end the Republic. Government buildings, radio stations, and command points were no longer abstract targets. They were destinations. The city's fate was being decided not at a distant front, but inside its own urban heart. That is what makes the moment so gripping. The end was not merely approaching the capital. It was physically crossing into it, one vehicle and one street at a time. A tank crashed through Independence Palace and became an instant icon. Few moments in modern history are so perfectly made for memory as the sight of a tank breaking through the gates of Independence Palace. The machine itself was powerful, but what truly made the image unforgettable was what it struck. This was not an anonymous wall on the edge of a battlefield. It was the entrance to the palace that symbolized South Vietnam's authority, continuity, and claim to legitimacy. When the tank crossed that threshold, it seemed to compress years of war into one violent motion. Steel met architecture, and symbolism shattered with the gate. The image became iconic so quickly because it did not need interpretation. Anyone watching could sense that a final barrier had been broken. The old order was no longer defending itself. It was being entered, overrun, and replaced. That is why the scene still feels so charged. It was not just a military advance. It was the visual instant when collapse became undeniable to the entire world. Soldiers rushed the palace that had embodied South Vietnam's fragile authority. Independence Palace mattered because it was more than an administrative building. It was the stage set of a state that had long struggled to appear permanent while living under immense pressure. Presidents worked there. Officials issued commands there. Ceremonies and decisions gave it the look of continuity. Yet by April of 1975, that authority had grown fragile, and everyone could sense it. When soldiers rushed the palace, they were not only seizing a location, they were overtaking the visible heart of a political project that had depended on force, alliance, and performance as much as on consent. That makes the moment especially revealing. States can seem solid right up until the instant their central symbols are breached. Once armed men were moving through those grounds, the palace no longer represented power. It represented exposed power. That reversal gives the scene its lasting force. A building designed to project rule became the place where the limits of that rule were publicly revealed. Duong Van Minh ordered South Vietnamese forces to stop fighting. At the center of the final morning stood a brief instruction with enormous consequences. Duong Van Minh, newly president and facing the reality of total defeat, ordered South Vietnamese forces to cease fighting. The command mattered because it transformed collapse into formal conclusion. Armies had already been broken in many places. The capital had already been entered. Yet a war does not fully end until someone with authority tells men with weapons to stop. That is what Minh did. His order was not triumphant, and it was not strategic in the usual sense. It was an acknowledgement that further resistance would only deepen destruction without changing the outcome. That is part of what makes the moment so compelling. He was not leading a bold final defense. He was ending one. In that decision, the last president of South Vietnam defined his place in history. He became the man who chose silence over more bloodshed when the state itself could no longer be saved. His surrender was broadcast by radio to a country already collapsing. Radio gave the final surrender its strange reach. Duong Van Minh's words did not stay within palace walls or military headquarters. They moved outward through the air to soldiers, civilians, and listeners, in a country that was already collapsing around them. That detail matters because radio had long been one of the central instruments of wartime power. Governments used it to inspire, instruct, warn, and reassure. On this day, it carried the opposite of reassurance. It carried the announcement that the struggle was over. For those hearing it, the effect must have been extraordinary. Some would have felt relief, some disbelief, some humiliation, some simple exhaustion. The broadcast joined private emotion to national history in one instant, because people did not have to wait for newspapers or rumor to learn what had happened. The state spoke directly, and what it said was surrender. Few technologies seem more haunting in wartime than radio at a moment like this, when a voice can announce that a whole political world has ended. The transfer of power happened faster than many people thought possible. One of the most astonishing features of Saigon's fall is the speed with which authority changed hands once the final moment arrived. History often teaches us to expect drawn-out transitions with negotiations, contested districts, and lingering ambiguity. Saigon offered something different. The southern government, already weakened beyond repair, gave way with startling rapidity once the decisive entry into the city began. That speed gave the event much of its shock. People who expected a prolonged urban struggle instead saw a political order disappear almost at once. Offices that had represented one state were suddenly under the control of another. The language of command changed. The assumptions of daily life changed. Even the meaning of caution changed, because people had to understand the new reality immediately or risk misreading everything around them. This is why the transfer of power still feels almost unreal. An entire capital moved from one governing system to another in a span so short that memory can hardly keep pace with it. Saigon did not fall after a long urban battle. It folded quickly. Many great capitals in wartime are imagined as places of barricades, block-by-block resistance, and prolonged final struggle. Saigon did not fit that pattern. Its end came with a speed and softness that made the collapse feel even more startling. There were armed movements, isolated clashes, and fear everywhere. Yet the city did not become the site of a vast, drawn-out urban battle. Instead, the political and military structure beneath it gave way so quickly that the capital seemed to fold inward rather than explode outward. That distinction is important. A long battle suggests stubborn continuity even in defeat. A quick folding suggests something more fragile, a system whose capacity to resist had already drained away before the final entrance. That is part of why the day remained so haunting. The city was not reduced through weeks of ruin. It simply could no longer hold its shape. One moment it was still the capital of South Vietnam. Then it was not. Some South Vietnamese units still fought even as surrender orders spread. Even when leaders issue surrender orders, war does not always stop at once. Messages travel unevenly. Loyalties differ. Confusion lingers. In the final hours around Saigon, some South Vietnamese units continued to fight, even as word spread that resistance was to end. That detail gives the story an important edge of realism. History can look smooth in retrospect, but real endings are full of lag, disbelief, and fragmented action. Some soldiers may not have heard the order yet. Others may have mistrusted it. Still others may have felt unable to stop after years of struggle, unless defeat was physically undeniable in front of them. This makes the final phase more human and more tragic. A state can surrender in one voice, while its remnants continue moving in many others. The result is a brief but intense overlap between official ending and lived ending. In that overlap, the old war still flickers, even while the new reality is already taking possession of the city. The war's final great image was a tank against palace gates. Every long conflict eventually finds the image that seems to summarize its ending, and for the Fall of Saigon, that image was the tank at the palace gates. It endures because it joined force and symbolism with rare precision. Helicopters had come to represent departure. The tank represented arrival. It showed not escape, but conquest. The palace gates gave that arrival a stage worthy of history. This was the entrance to the executive heart of South Vietnam, and the armored vehicle before it seemed to embody the unstoppable momentum that had carried the North to victory. The image also worked because it was so simple. One machine, one barrier, one state at its last threshold. People did not need a long explanation to understand the moment. They could see the outcome in the geometry of the scene. That is why the picture lasted. It was not only evidence of success in battle, it was a visual declaration that the war's final chapter had been closed by force. By noon, the republic that once claimed the city was gone. There is something almost unbelievable in the pace of that final day. By noon, the republic that had claimed Saigon as its capital had effectively ceased to exist. Governments usually disappear through slower processes, through exile, partition, prolonged transition, or years of erosion made formal at last. Here, the decisive disappearance felt compressed into a single morning. That speed is part of what gives the Fall of Saigon its enduring power. It reminds us that states can look official, armed, and internationally recognized right up until the hour they no longer are. By midday, the signs of the old republic still stood in places, but their meaning had drained away. Titles, offices, and commands belonged to a world that had just ended. What remained was the beginning of a different order. The noon hour therefore feels almost like a line drawn through history. On one side stood South Vietnam. On the other stood the country and memory that would follow. Soon after, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. When a city changes its name after a war, the change is never only administrative. It is a declaration about memory, legitimacy, and who now has the power to define the past. Soon after the fall, Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and that act carried immense symbolic force. The old name had been tied to colonial layers, Southern identity, commerce, and the vanished republic. The new name bound the city to the revolutionary figure who had become the central father symbol of victorious Vietnam. In one decision, the map itself was made to speak a different political language. That is what makes the renaming so fascinating. It shows how victory does not stop at buildings, armies, or ministries. It reaches into everyday speech. It alters addresses, headlines, official papers, and the very words people use to locate themselves. A city that millions had known by one name was now being asked to carry another history every time it was spoken aloud. The city's new name announced victory, reunification, and a rewritten national story. Names can function like speeches, and this new one did exactly that. It proclaimed that the war had not merely ended, but ended in a way that favored one national narrative over another. To call the city Ho Chi Minh City was to fold the southern capital into the revolutionary story of Vietnamese reunification under communist leadership. That made the name far more than a label. It became a public argument about what the war had meant. The old division between North and South was being pushed aside in favor of a single victorious storyline, one centered on independence, sacrifice, and national completion. This is why the change resonated so widely. It reached beyond maps into classrooms, ceremonies, newspapers, and memory itself. The city was not only being administered by a new power, it was being narrated anew. Every official use of the name helped teach the same lesson. The war's outcome was now written into geography, and geography would repeat it daily. For many Vietnamese, liberation and loss arrived on the same day. Few great historical moments divide emotion as sharply as the fall of Saigon. For many Vietnamese, the day brought jubilation, relief, and a sense that a long national struggle had finally reached fulfillment. For many others, the same day brought fear, grief, and the collapse of everything familiar. That split is one reason the event remains so emotionally complex. It cannot be contained inside one mood. Liberation and loss arrived together because the end of one political order meant the triumph of another, and different people stood on opposite sides of that transformation. A soldier of the North, a supporter of the southern state, a weary civilian who simply wanted the bombing and uncertainty to stop. Each could experience the same date in radically different ways. That makes the history feel especially alive. It resists simplification. The city did not produce one emotional truth on that day. It produced many, and they continued to live side by side long after the fighting ended. The fall ended one state and began another chapter of Vietnam. What happened in Saigon was not simply the defeat of an army or the capture of a capital. It was the ending of a state. South Vietnam, as a separate political entity, ceased to exist. That is a profound kind of historical event because states are built to appear durable. They issue passports, field armies, collect taxes, teach children, appoint ministers, and present themselves as facts of life. Then, sometimes, they vanish. The fall of Saigon marked exactly that kind of disappearance. Yet endings in history are rarely pure endings. They also create openings. In this case, the disappearance of one state became the beginning of a new chapter in a reunified Vietnam under communist rule. That chapter would bring its own ambitions, disciplines, hardships, and transformations. This is what gives the moment its scale. It was not merely the last page of one story. It was the hinge between two different political worlds. One was closing in front of cameras and surrender orders. The other was beginning immediately. Families were split across oceans by the speed of those final days. The speed of Saigon's collapse did more than overwhelm governments. It tore through families with almost no time for repair. In the rush to leave, people were separated by missed meetings, broken transport links, lost papers, and impossible decisions made in minutes. A husband might reach a helicopter while his wife could not. Parents might send a child ahead. Siblings could end up on different ships, in different camps, or in different countries altogether. That is part of what makes the story so deeply moving. The fall was not only a national rupture, it was a domestic one, multiplied thousands of times. Oceans then turned these sudden separations into long realities. People who had expected reunion in days faced months or years of silence, uncertainty, and bureaucratic struggle. Some never found one another again. When we think of the fall of Saigon, it is easy to picture helicopters and flags. It is harder, and perhaps more important, to picture the family tables that were broken apart almost overnight. Refugee journeys did not begin after the fall. They exploded because of it. Displacement had already marked the Vietnam War long before Saigon fell. Civilians had fled battles, bombings, and shifting front lines for years. Yet the collapse of the capital acted like an accelerant, turning existing displacement into a far larger refugee crisis. That distinction matters. The fall did not invent flight, but it transformed its scale, urgency, and direction. Suddenly, departure was not only about escaping one battlefield or one offensive. It was about leaving an entire political future behind. People moved through airlifts, camps, coastal routes, and later sea passages because the state they had known was gone, and the next one inspired fear or uncertainty. The fall therefore functioned like a historical detonation in human movement. It pushed people outward across borders and oceans with new intensity. This helps explain why the event echoes so widely beyond the city itself. Its consequences traveled with bodies, memories, languages, and identities. Once Saigon fell, the story of movement did not end. It accelerated dramatically. The human story of Saigon's fall stretched far beyond the city itself. Although the world remembers rooftops, palace gates, and embassy walls, the true human reach of the fall extended far past Saigon's streets. Its consequences spread into provincial towns, foreign capitals, refugee camps, and family conversations that would continue for decades. A clerk in Saigon, a fisherman on the coast, a student in France, a sponsor in America, all could be touched by the same turning point in different ways. That breadth is what makes the event so remarkable. A city's collapse became a transnational human story. It altered where people lived, what languages their children spoke, which holidays they marked, and how they explained the past to the next generation. History often appears concentrated in one dramatic place, then unfolds its real meaning elsewhere over time. Saigon is a perfect example. The city served as the visible stage, but the emotional and social consequences traveled outward in widening circles. The fall belonged to one location, yet its human afterlife belonged to the world. What ended in Saigon would echo through camps, boats, and diasporas. The Fall of Saigon was a visible ending, but many of its most enduring consequences unfolded in less photographed places afterward. Refugee camps became spaces of waiting, sorting, hoping, and uncertainty. Boats became vehicles of risk, carrying people into dangerous waters in search of futures they could not yet see. Diasporas formed in cities far from Vietnam, where memory of the fall remained vivid even as daily life changed language and setting. This is what gives the event such long resonance. It did not remain sealed inside one date. It kept speaking through movement and resettlement. Camps, boats, and diasporas each tell a different part of that afterstory. Camps reveal suspension, when people lived between past and future. Boats reveal danger, when survival still depended on chance and courage. Diasporas reveal transformation, when loss becomes community and memory becomes inheritance. Saigon ended as a capital of one state, but it continued as a living point of origin for lives scattered across the globe. For survivors, the date became memory, exile, reunion, and unresolved grief. Some historical dates stay in calendars. Others take up residence inside people. For many survivors of the Fall of Saigon, the 30th of April became exactly that kind of date. It could summon memory with painful immediacy, not only of public events, but of private moments. Who was lost, who escaped, who waited, and who never returned. Over time, the same date could carry several meanings at once. For some, it marked exile and the beginning of a life elsewhere. For others, it became tied to eventual reunion after years of separation. Yet even reunion did not erase grief. That is one reason the date remains so charged. It is not a finished memory. It continues to work inside families and communities, changing shape across generations. Children and grandchildren inherit stories attached to it, even if they did not live through the fall themselves. The day, therefore, survives as more than history. It survives as a recurring emotional landmark in human lives. The end of the war did not end its consequences. There is a natural temptation to think of wars as stories that conclude when guns fall silent or capitals change hands. The Fall of Saigon warns against that illusion. The war ended, but its consequences moved onward through politics, memory, migration, imprisonment, economics, and family life. Some consequences were immediate. Others unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, over years. That long aftermath is part of what makes the event so historically rich. The final day was dramatic, but the decades after it carried their own quieter dramas. People rebuilt lives in unfamiliar countries. Vietnam itself entered a new political era with all the challenges and transformations that followed. Arguments about the war continued in classrooms, films, memoirs, and public debate. Trauma continued in bodies and habits. This is why the Fall of Saigon remains more than a striking ending. It is also a lesson in how endings behave. They do not simply close a door. Often they keep sending consequences through it for generations after the noise has passed. Australia evacuated its embassy days before Saigon finally collapsed. Australia's departure from Saigon is a striking reminder that the city's fall was not only an American drama. Other governments were watching the same darkening horizon and making their own painful calculations. When Australia evacuated its embassy days before the end, it signaled that confidence in the South's survival had ebbed far beyond Washington. Diplomatic compounds are meant to project continuity. They suggest that a state still expects tomorrow. Closing one says the opposite. It says, tomorrow may no longer belong to the government now in charge. That is what makes Australia's move so revealing. It shows how the unraveling of Saigon could be read from outside, as well as from within. A foreign ally looked at the same approaching crisis and decided its people could not safely remain. In that sense, the embassy's evacuation was more than a logistical act. It was an international reading of the moment, and that reading proved brutally accurate within days. The last Australians left on the 25th of April. Dates can sharpen history, and the 25th of April does exactly that here. It tells us that Australia's final departure came not at the very last minute, but several days before Saigon fell on the 30th. That gap matters because it reveals how quickly the final week was tightening. By the time the last Australians left, the city was still standing, yet the direction of events had become frighteningly clear. This gives the departure a tense and almost prophetic quality. It was an exit made in advance of the final spectacle, before tanks reached the palace, and before the most iconic helicopter images fixed themselves in memory. In other words, some allies had already concluded that the ending would not be delayed much longer. The date also carries a subtle emotional force. A government had to choose the moment when staying no longer seemed responsible. The 25th of April became that moment, a quiet line drawn before the louder collapse. Other countries watched the city fall while calculating their own exits. As Saigon moved toward its final days, foreign governments found themselves in a grim position shared by all collapsing capitals. They had to keep watching events unfold while also asking how long their own nationals could safely remain. This double vision makes the scene especially compelling. Diplomats and officials were not detached observers. They were embedded inside the crisis, yet trying to think one step ahead of it. Every shift at the front, every rumor of attack, every new sign of governmental weakness could alter the timetable for departure. That meant the fall of Saigon was experienced internationally as both spectacle and calculation. Different embassies, missions, and foreign communities had to measure risk against duty, symbolism against safety. Some waited longer. Some moved earlier. All were reading the same unstable city through their own national priorities. That is one reason the final week feels so charged. Saigon was not only collapsing, it was forcing the world inside it to solve the problem of leaving. The crisis exposed how international alliances can vanish with shocking speed. Alliances often look solid while power still holds, yet crises reveal how conditional they can be. Saigon exposed that truth with painful clarity. South Vietnam had existed within a web of promises, partnerships, military support, and diplomatic recognition. For years, those relationships helped sustain the impression that the Republic belonged to a larger protective order. Then the crisis accelerated, and that protective order began to shrink with startling speed. Allies still mattered, but their ability and willingness to remain physically present narrowed fast. That is what makes this moment so fascinating and so unsettling. The outward architecture of international support had seemed impressive. The final days showed how quickly such architecture can empty when military and political reality turns against it. This was not simply abandonment in a sentimental sense. It was a lesson in how alliances behave under pressure. They are powerful, but not magical. When the center gives way, even long-standing commitments can recede with astonishing suddenness. America's allies saw the same ending through very different national memories. One of the most interesting features of Saigon's final days is that Allied countries did not interpret the scene in identical emotional or historical terms. They were looking at the same collapsing capital, yet each nation brought its own memory of the war, its own political arguments, and its own sense of what had been at stake. For Americans, the ending touched questions of intervention, credibility, and national trauma. For Australians, it connected to their own role as an ally that had joined the conflict and now had to reckon with the result. Other partners saw still different meanings. This gives the event a rich international texture. There was no single Allied memory forming in perfect unity. Instead, multiple national stories were converging on the same visual ending. The helicopters, the embassies, and the surrender all appeared before different historical mirrors. That matters because it reminds us that global events are never remembered globally in one uniform way. They splinter into distinct national afterlives. Diplomats, journalists, pilots, and orphans all experienced different versions of the same collapse. The Fall of Saigon can seem like one event, but lived experience fractured it into many separate worlds. A diplomat might remember frantic cables, sealed rooms, and the burden of official decisions. A journalist might remember deadlines, vantage points, and the chase for one image that captured everything. A pilot might remember wake limits, fuel, rotor wash, and the brief terror of each landing. An orphan might remember confusion, strange adults, and the sensation of being carried into an unknown future. That range is what makes the history so emotionally rich. The same collapse moved through entirely different bodies and professions, creating separate memories of one shared ending. No single viewpoint can contain it all. That is why the story remains so compelling. It rewards us for looking sideways, not only upward at leaders and symbols. Once we do, Saigon becomes not one drama, but many overlapping dramas, each with its own sound, pace, and sense of what the end actually felt like. Operation Baby Lift unfolded in the shadow of Saigon's impending fall. Operation Baby Lift carries a haunting place in the final weeks before Saigon fell because it joined rescue, urgency, and uncertainty in one emotionally charged mission. The effort sought to fly Vietnamese children, many from orphanages, out of the country as the military situation worsened. That aim sounds simple at first, even noble in a direct and immediate way. Yet the setting makes it far more complex. These flights unfolded while the capital's future was collapsing, while families were being separated, and while the moral clarity of every rescue decision was strained by panic and incomplete information. That is what gives the operation its lasting fascination. It was an attempt to save vulnerable lives inside a moment when almost nothing could be done without ambiguity. The shadow of Saigon's impending fall was therefore not just military. It was ethical and emotional too. Even acts of protection were shaped by fear, haste, and the knowledge that time for choosing was vanishing fast. Its first flight crashed, adding tragedy to an already desperate month. The first flight of Operation Baby Lift did not become a symbol of rescue alone. It became a symbol of tragedy as well. When the aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff, the disaster deepened the sense that April 1975 had become a month in which even attempts at salvation were vulnerable to catastrophe. That is part of what makes the event so heartbreaking. A mission intended to carry children towards safety instead became another scene of loss in a period already thick with fear and dislocation. The crash also shattered any illusion that humanitarian efforts could stand outside the chaos surrounding them. They were embedded in the same unstable moment, exposed to the same risks, and burdened by the same urgency. In this way, the disaster became more than an accident. It became a dark emblem of the time itself. Even hope was fragile. Even rescue could fail. The month seemed determined to remind everyone that history was exacting a terrible price from every direction. Even rescue efforts from those days remain morally and emotionally complicated. One reason the final days before the fall of Saigon still provoke such deep reflection is that even the most compassionate actions resist simple judgment. Rescue efforts saved lives, yet they also raised difficult questions about consent, separation, responsibility, and who had the authority to decide another person's future in a moment of collapse. That complexity does not cancel the courage involved. It makes it more human. People were trying to do good inside conditions that warped every choice. A child removed for safety might also be removed from language, kinship, and origins. A hurried evacuation could feel merciful to one person and devastating to another. This is why the moral landscape of those days remained so compelling. It refuses neat categories. Acts of care were real. So were confusion, grief, and later doubt. The history becomes richer when we allow all of that to stand together. Rescue was not false, but neither was it uncomplicated. In Saigon's last days, almost nothing truly was. The fall of Saigon was global news, but intensely personal history. Few events bridged the public and private as completely as the fall of Saigon. It was global news in the fullest sense. Newspapers, radio bulletins, and television audiences around the world followed the helicopters, the palace, the surrender, and the end of a war that had already shaped international politics for years. Yet for the people inside it, the event was never merely news. It was life being broken, redirected, or remade in real time. That tension gives the history much of its enduring power. The same image that appeared on front pages might also mark the moment a family lost contact, a career vanished, a homeland was left behind, or a child entered a future no one could yet describe. This is why the fall still feels so vivid. It existed simultaneously at two scales. It was a world event that altered geopolitics, and a deeply personal event carried in memory, names, and absences. Both scales are true, and neither can replace the other. The famous evacuation was only the final act, not the whole story. The helicopters above Saigon have become the best-known image of the ending, yet they were only the last visible movement in a much longer drama. Long before those final flights, years of political strain, military pressure, negotiations, broken hopes, and shrinking options had already shaped the outcome. That is what makes the evacuation so powerful and so misleading at the same time. It feels like the whole story because it is so cinematic, but in truth, it was the closing scene of a much deeper unraveling. To understand the end, you have to look behind the rotors and rooftops to the forces that made those images necessary. The final act was spectacular because everything before it had steadily narrowed the available choices. By the time helicopters became the focus, the larger structure had already been failing for a long while. The evacuation matters enormously, but it is most meaningful when seen as the last expression of a far broader collapse. South Vietnam did not collapse because of one battle alone. It is tempting to search for one decisive battle, one fatal mistake, or one dramatic turning point that explains why South Vietnam fell. History is rarely that tidy. The collapse came from accumulation as much as from confrontation. Military defeats mattered, of course, but so did political fragility, dependence on outside support, declining resources, strategic misjudgments, and the gradual weakening of confidence across the system. States often survive terrible battles if their institutions remain resilient. They struggle to survive when pressure arrives from every direction at once. That is what makes the end of South Vietnam so fascinating. It was not undone by one thunderclap, but by many forces converging until resistance became too brittle to absorb another shock. This gives the story a deeper richness than a single battle narrative could provide. The Republic fell because its supports had been eroded over time, and when the final blows came, there was no longer enough strength beneath the surface to hold the structure together. Years of policy, politics, and attrition converged in those last days. The final days in Saigon feel dramatic because so many long-running forces suddenly became visible together. Policy choices made in Washington, Saigon, and Hanoi over many years all pressed toward that same narrowing moment. Domestic politics had shaped aid, strategy, and public will. Diplomatic efforts had raised hopes without resolving the deeper conflict. Attrition had worn down armies, communities, and patience alike. By late April of 1975, all those strands were no longer separate. They were converging in one city, one timetable, and one unbearable sense of acceleration. That is what gives the ending its unusual density. Every helicopter, surrender order, and embassy gate carried the weight of decisions made far earlier and far away. The final days were not only about what happened then. They were about everything that had been building toward then. Saigon became the place where years of argument, endurance, loss, and calculation finally met and could no longer be postponed. The fall shocked the world partly because the collapse happened so fast. Speed can make history feel unreal, and that is exactly what happened when Saigon fell. Observers around the world had known the situation was worsening, yet the pace of the final collapse still stunned many who were watching. There is a difference between expecting trouble and witnessing a state unravel in a matter of days. That speed stripped away the comforting illusion that there would be more time for negotiation, more time for evacuation, or more time for some final stabilization. Instead, events outran expectation. Cities were lost, leadership shifted, foreign missions departed, and the capital itself gave way with startling swiftness. This helped make the fall so unforgettable. It was not only tragic or symbolic, it was disorienting. The world saw a government go from precarious to finished with a rapidity that made ordinary political language seem inadequate. In that sense, speed became part of the shock itself. The collapse did not only happen, it arrived faster than many minds were prepared to absorb. American officials had plans, but the city still outran the timetable. Planning is one of the great habits of governments, especially in crisis. Lists are made, scenarios are drafted, contingencies are refined, and officials try to impose sequence on uncertainty. Saigon shows both the usefulness and the limits of that instinct. American officials did have plans for evacuation and emergency withdrawal, yet the city's collapse still moved faster than the timetable those plans hoped to manage. That tension is part of what makes the ending so gripping. It was not a story of total blindness. It was a story of partial preparation meeting events that refused to stay within prepared boundaries. Every plan depends on assumptions about time, order, and access. When those assumptions fail, even careful planning can feel suddenly too small. Saigon outran the timetable because collapse has a way of accelerating once confidence breaks. The result was a final scramble in which preparation still mattered greatly, but no longer guaranteed control. The city was moving toward its end faster than bureaucracy could fully choreograph. Intelligence, diplomacy, and military logistics all collided in one chaotic evacuation. The final evacuation of Saigon is so fascinating because it was not only a military operation. It was the point where several worlds of statecraft slammed together under extreme pressure. Intelligence officers had to think about networks, secrets, and who was at risk if left behind. Diplomats had to balance symbolism, responsibility, and the management of a collapsing political relationship. Military planners had to solve the raw mechanics of transport, security, fuel, timing, and capacity. In calmer times, these functions can operate in parallel. In Saigon's final hours, they collided in the same shrinking space. That collision created much of the chaos. The needs of secrecy did not always align neatly with the needs of public order. The imperatives of diplomacy did not always align neatly with the imperatives of extraction. This is what gives the evacuation such texture. It was not one machine acting smoothly. It was many different state machines grinding against each other, while trying to save as much as possible before the window closed. Helicopters became the last bridge between one regime and the sea. By the final stage of the evacuation, helicopters were doing more than carrying passengers. They had become the physical link between a dying political order on land and the uncertain refuge waiting offshore. That image gives the moment extraordinary power. A bridge usually suggests stability, something fixed and reliable. These bridges were airborne, noisy, temporary, and vulnerable to time. Yet for those still trying to leave, they were the only remaining connection between one world and the next. On one side stood the collapsing institutions of South Vietnam and the departing American presence. On the other stood the ships at sea, along with the possibility of survival, exile, and a future not yet understood. This makes the helicopters feel almost mythic in the story. They were machines, but they also carried the emotional weight of transition itself. Each flight crossed more than physical distance. It crossed from one regime's final hours into the open uncertainty that followed beyond the coast. The palace, the embassy, and the radio each shaped how we remember it. Historical memory often settles around places and devices that seem to gather meaning beyond their practical roles. In the Fall of Saigon, 3 stand out with special force. The palace became the symbol of political capture and state collapse. The embassy became the symbol of last chances, foreign withdrawal, and desperate waiting. The radio became the instrument through which coded departure and formal surrender entered the air itself. Together, these 3 elements helped build the emotional architecture of memory. One was the seat of authority. One was the threshold of escape. One was the voice that carried hidden signals and public endings. That combination is part of why the story remains so vivid. It is grounded in specific, memorable forms. A gate, a compound, a broadcast. History does not always leave such clean anchors behind. Here, it did. The palace, the embassy, and the radio gave the ending places to inhabit, and those places still help the imagination return to it with unusual clarity. Few events capture the end of an era as vividly. Some historical endings are important but visually dull. Others are dramatic but narrow in meaning. The Fall of Saigon stands out because it did something rarer. It captured the end of an era with clarity, emotion, and unmistakable symbolic force. The era in question was not only the long Vietnam War. It was also a broader period of Cold War confidence, intervention, ideological struggle, and belief in what power could shape abroad. That larger significance is part of what gives the event its unusual vividness. A capital falls. A superpower departs. A revolutionary movement triumphs. Civilians flee. Cameras record it all. Few endings gather so many historical currents into such a concentrated series of scenes. That is why the moment continues to feel larger than itself. It belongs to Vietnam, but it also belongs to a wider global imagination of how eras close. Not with tidy statements or elegant transitions, but with unforgettable images that make the turning of history suddenly visible. The Fall of Saigon turned history into images the world still sees. Many events matter deeply in their own time, then fade into specialist memory. The Fall of Saigon did not fade that way. It became part of the world's lasting visual memory because it turned complicated history into images that continue to circulate across documentaries, textbooks, museums, and family recollection. That transformation is remarkable. Most people do not carry detailed knowledge of policy debates or military timelines in their heads. They carry scenes. A helicopter above a roof. A tank at a gate. Crowds pressing toward escape. Those scenes have survived because they translated enormous historical forces into forms the eye can hold. This is why the fall remains so present even decades later. It did not merely happen and then get described. It happened in a way that became visible, and that visibility kept the event alive in public consciousness. History became image, and image became memory. The world still sees Saigon because Saigon's ending learned how to remain before the human eye. Some evacuees left with documents proving identity, others with almost nothing. In the final departures from Saigon, what people carried often revealed how abruptly history had entered their lives. Some evacuees arrived with folders, passes, letters of employment, passports, and stamped papers that proved who they were and why they might be allowed through. Others came with almost nothing at all, because the collapse had moved too fast for orderly packing, or because life had already been stripped down by fear. That contrast is deeply moving. One person held a whole official self in a handful of documents. Another held only memory, urgency, and a hope that someone would believe them without proof. It shows how fragile identity can become in a crisis. Under normal conditions, papers sit quietly in drawers and offices. In Saigon's last hours, they could separate escape from exclusion. Yet even paperwork had limits. A person might possess every necessary document and still lose their chance. Another might board with barely more than the clothes they wore and the life they could still imagine ahead. Assembly points across Saigon quietly mapped who might escape and where. Long before the most famous images fixed themselves in public memory, a quieter geography of possible escape had already spread across Saigon. Assembly points were designated at homes, offices, compounds, and other locations where selected people were meant to gather if the final evacuation began. This hidden map is one of the most fascinating features of the story because it turned the city into a network of secret expectations. Ordinary streets held extraordinary meaning for those who knew where to wait. A familiar building could suddenly become a doorway to exile. A missed message could mean standing in the wrong place, while history moved elsewhere. These assembly points reveal how evacuation depends on invisible planning as much as visible drama. The city was not only collapsing above ground in the public imagination, it was also being quietly reorganized into nodes of possibility and risk. Somewhere behind every famous rooftop scene lay this less visible map, deciding who might reach departure and from where. Air America played a larger role than many people realize. When people picture the end of Saigon, they often think first of Marines, embassy guards, and military helicopters. Yet another aviation story was woven through the final phase, and it deserves far more attention. Air America, the airline closely tied to American intelligence operations in Southeast Asia, played a significant role in moving people and supporting the wider evacuation structure. Its very presence adds another layer of intrigue to the Fall. This was not an ordinary airline in an ordinary emergency. It belonged to the secretive underside of American involvement in the region, where transport, covert work, and crisis response often overlapped. That makes its participation especially compelling. The collapse of Saigon did not activate only formal diplomatic and military channels. It also drew in this shadowy aviation network that had long operated in the background of the war. In the final emergency, even the hidden machinery of American power had to come out and carry part of the burden. Offshore carriers became temporary cities for people between countries and futures. When evacuees reached the American ships offshore, they did not arrive at a final home. They arrived in an in-between world. Aircraft carriers and support ships became temporary cities filled with noise, urgency, relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Decks built for warplanes now held families, bundles, children, translators, pilots, and officials who had crossed out of one political world but not yet entered another. That liminal quality makes the carriers so fascinating. They were floating pieces of order, but also floating spaces of suspension. People aboard them were safe from immediate danger, yet many still had no clear idea where they would go next, what country would receive them, or how their lives would be rebuilt. The ships, therefore, became more than naval platforms. They became waiting rooms between nations. In that sense, they belonged perfectly to the story of Saigon's fall. The ending did not send people straight into certainty. It first placed them on steel islands between past and future. The embassy rooftop became famous, but most evacuees left from elsewhere. Popular memory loves a single dramatic location, and in the case of Saigon, that location became the embassy rooftop. Yet the true evacuation story was broader and more dispersed than that famous image suggests. Most evacuees did not leave from the rooftop of the embassy itself. Many departed earlier through the airport. Others were lifted from different collection points, rooftops, compounds, and designated sites across the city. This matters because it restores scale to the event. The embassy became the symbol of the ending, but symbols can narrow our vision even while they clarify it. The evacuation was not one staircase and one helicopter repeated over and over. It was a sprawling rescue effort spread across many spaces, each with its own pressures and decisions. That wider picture makes the story even more extraordinary. The famous roof remains unforgettable, but it was only the brightest point in a much larger constellation of departures, unfolding all over a city in its final hours. The fall ended America's war, but not Vietnam's long healing. For the United States, the fall of Saigon marked the end of its direct military story in Vietnam. For Vietnam itself, the ending opened a different and longer struggle, the struggle to heal after decades of warfare, division, destruction, and displacement. That distinction matters deeply. Foreign powers can leave a war and call it finished. The country that hosted the war must keep living inside what it damaged. Villages, families, institutions, landscapes, and memories all carry forward the burden. This is one reason the event remains so moving. It reminds us that endings are unevenly distributed. One nation's withdrawal can be another nation's beginning of recovery, reconstruction, and reckoning. Healing is also harder to photograph than evacuation. It happens across years through policy, silence, labor, remembrance, and ordinary survival. The fall therefore stands at a moral crossroads in history. It closed one chapter of intervention, but the people of Vietnam still faced the far slower task of living beyond the ruins that chapter had helped create. In Vietnam today, the date is remembered as reunification, not collapse. Historical dates do not carry the same meaning for everyone, and nowhere is that clearer than in how modern Vietnam commemorates the 30th of April. Within Vietnam, the day is officially remembered as a triumph of reunification and liberation, rather than as the collapse suggested by the phrase, Fall of Saigon. That difference in language reveals the power of perspective. The same event can be framed as national victory from one viewpoint and as devastating loss from another. In Vietnam's official memory, the date marks the successful end of division and the restoration of the country under one government. Ceremonies, education, and public language reinforce that meaning. This is fascinating because it shows how nations shape memory not only through monuments and speeches, but through the names they choose for decisive days. History remains the same in one sense, yet its emotional framing shifts profoundly. The calendar becomes a battleground of meaning long after the guns and helicopters have fallen silent. In exile communities, the same date still carries mourning and memory. Far from Vietnam, the 30th of April lives on in another emotional register. In many exile communities, especially among Vietnamese who fled the communist victory or whose families were broken by it, the date is marked not as reunification, but as a day of mourning, remembrance, and kra, unresolved sorrow. This gives the event one of its most powerful afterlives. A single date continues to divide memory across oceans and generations. In one place, it is celebrated. In another, it is grieved. That split makes the history feel vividly alive because it has not settled into one accepted emotional meaning. Within exile communities, commemorations often carry stories of lost homes, interrupted futures, dangerous departures, and loved ones left behind. These observances are not only about the past. They are also about identity in the present, about what must be preserved when geography and politics have been lost. The date endures because memory became one of the few homelands that could still be carried intact. The story endures because it joins strategy, symbolism, and human desperation. Some historical events survive in memory because they were strategically important. Others endure because they were emotionally overwhelming. The Fall of Saigon has lasted so powerfully because it joined several kinds of meaning at once. It was a strategic turning point in the Cold War and in the history of Vietnam. It was also loaded with symbolism, from palace gates to embassy walls to helicopters rising over a city at the edge of transformation. And beneath those grand meanings stood raw human desperation, people trying to escape, decide, endure, and understand what was happening to their lives. That combination is rare. It gives the story both intellectual depth and immediate emotional force. You can study it as policy, as military collapse, as media event, or as personal catastrophe, and each angle still feels essential. The event endures because none of those layers cancels the others. They lock together. Strategy explains the shape. Symbolism explains the memory. Human desperation explains why we still feel it. Few endings in modern history feel this cinematic, intimate, and consequential. The Fall of Saigon continues to grip the imagination because it seems to combine the scale of epic history with the closeness of private life. It feels cinematic because the scenes are so vivid. Helicopters above rooftops, tanks at gates, crowds waiting, radios carrying final words. Yet it also feels intimate because every image implies individuals making frightened and immediate decisions. This blend is what gives the ending its unusual power. Many events are consequential without being memorable to the eye. Others are visually dramatic without reshaping the world beyond the moment. Saigon did both. It marked the end of a long war, the defeat of one state, the triumph of another, and the beginning of vast afterlives in migration and memory. At the same time, it remained deeply human in scale. The greatest historical endings often work this way. They are world-changing and heartbreakingly personal together. Few modern endings have held those qualities in such unforgettable balance. As we come to the end of our journey tonight, we can let the story of Saigon grow softer in the mind. We have followed a city through its final hours as helicopters crossed the sky, radios carried strange and fateful messages, and palace gates gave way to a new chapter of history. We have seen how a war that lasted for years could narrow into a single morning, and how that morning held courage, fear, loss, escape, and lives changed forever. We have drifted through embassies and rooftops, through crowded streets and waiting ships at sea. We have traced the fall of a capital, the ending of one state, and the beginning of another. And behind all of it, we have glimpsed the human heart of history, in papers clutched in trembling hands, in families pulled apart by time, and in memories that would travel far beyond Vietnam itself. Now there is nothing more you need to hold on to. Let the images recede. Let the noise of engines and radios fade into the distance. Let the streets grow still. Let the sea grow calm. If you enjoyed this journey through history, I would love for you to like, subscribe, or leave a comment below. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another video waiting for you on screen, ready to carry you into the next quiet corner of the past. But for now, simply rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders loosen. Allow the day to slip away, and let your thoughts drift gently into the dark. Sleep well, and good night.